The faint, acrid tang of the crawl's burnt ceremonial incense clings to the inside of my modified nasal cavity, and I don't dare exhale too sharp as High Warlord Gorthak's golden, multifaceted eye swivels to lock on my position at the lower tier of the council dais. My biometric mimicry implant is still humming warm under the layer of synthetic crawl chitin I've worn for 17 standard galactic cycles. The tiny feedback loop that keeps my heart rate matching the baseline of a low-level crawl logistics coordinator, just barely holding steady as the warlord's clawed hand taps the obsidian arm of his throne, slow, deliberate, each tap echoing like a gavel strike in the vaulted chamber. The rest of the council is silent, the 8 other alien species representatives all leaning forward slightly, their own bioluminescent markings flaring with idle curiosity as Gorthak's gaze drags over my face, over the fake scar I carved into my left cheek during my first infiltration drill, over the small data slate tucked under my claw that holds the fake shipment manifests I've spent 3 cycles fabricating. Every line cross-referenced with real crawl bureaucratic records so thoroughly even their internal auditors couldn't spot a discrepancy. "You," Gorthak rumbles, his voice a low vibration that rattles the crystal carafes of fermented blood mead sitting on the dais between us, the one who filed the complaint about the Vera slave labor shortages on the rimward mining colonies. "You claim the human resistance cells are sabotaging the extraction drills." My throat goes dry and I have to force myself to swallow before I speak, mimicking the slight guttural croak common to mid-tier crawl bureaucrats who spend too much time breathing recycled air and too little time in the sun. "Not sabotage, warlord, sabotage is crude. The humans are exploiting a loophole in your colony labor charter, Section 7, subsection C, which mandates that any worker who suffers a permanent non-replaceable injury in the line of duty is to be granted manumission and passage off-world. They're breaking their own limbs, falsifying medical reports, filing the paperwork through the exact same bureaucratic channels you approved when you annexed the Vera system 2 cycles back. Your own labor inspectors are signing off on it because the paperwork is perfect. No explosions, no ambushes, no dead crawl guards. Just paperwork." A murmur ripples through the council, the slender, silver-scaled Vera representative to my left hissing sharply, their own claws tightening around their data slate so hard the edges crack. I don't look at them. I keep my eyes fixed on Gorthak, counting the thumps of my own heart under the implant, making sure it stays exactly 62 beats per minute, the baseline for a crawl functionary who's nervous but not lying. Gorthak's eye narrows and he leans forward, the leathery folds of his neck creaking. "You expect me to believe the soft, squishy humans are outmaneuvering my entire labor administration with nothing but ink and lies?" I tilt my head, the exact subtle tilt I've practiced in front of a mirror 1,000 times, the one that says I'm half annoyed, half amused by the warlord's ignorance. "With all respect, warlord, you signed the charter yourself. I have the copy of your signature right here." I tap the data slate under my claw, and the hologram of the charter pops up, the smudge of Gorthak's actual claw mark clear as day. The forgery so perfect I had to bribe a crawl archival clerk with a crate of rare off-world synthale to get the original document scanned so I could replicate the exact pressure of his claw on the digital pad. "If you want to fix the loophole, you have to rewrite the entire labor code for every crawl-held system in the sector. That's 127 different planetary administrations, 12,000 separate clauses, and it'll take a minimum of 6 standard cycles to push through the council vote, assuming none of the other representatives here try to block it to get concessions out of you for their own trade deals." I pause, letting that sink in, letting the weight of the bureaucratic nightmare I'm describing land in the silent chamber. "Or you can just issue an executive order waiving the manumission clause for Vera workers only, and the humans will stop filing the paperwork tomorrow. No bloodshed, no wasted resources on extra security patrols, no public relations disaster if word gets out that you're reneging on a public charter you signed in front of the entire galactic concordat." Gorthak stares at me for a long, silent minute, and I can feel the sweat beating under the edge of my chitin mask, the implant's feedback loop spiking to 68 beats per minute for half a second before I force it back down, thinking of the training tapes my handler made me watch. The ones where a crawl bureaucrat who gets caught lying is flayed alive and hung from the spire's highest parapet as a warning to others. Finally, the warlord huffs a sharp, barking sound and taps his thrown arm again. "Fine, executive order, but you," he points a claw at me, "you're in charge of drafting it, no loopholes. If I find even one Vera worker manumitted because you missed a clause, I'll peel that fake chitin off your bones myself." I bow my head, the exact subservient bow required for a low-level functionary being given a promotion by a superior, and I can feel the corners of my mouth twitching up under the mask, just for a second. Because the executive order I'm going to draft has 3 hidden clauses buried in 400 pages of legal jargon. One that mandates all Vera workers get a 20% pay increase. One that requires crawl guards to be rotated off the mining colonies every 30 days, so they can't form bonds with the workers and look the other way when the humans sneak weapons and medical supplies past the blockades. And one that classifies all sabotage of mining equipment as a minor administrative infraction, instead of a capital offense. So the resistance can keep disabling the drills without the crawl executing half the colony population in retaliation. The Vera representative hisses again, louder this time, and I glance at them out of the corner of my eye just for a fraction of a second and see the tiny, almost imperceptible nod they give me. They know what I'm doing. The rest of the council is already moving on to the next agenda item, arguing about trade tariffs with the silicon-based hive clusters, and I sit back in my seat, tapping my data slate like I'm already drafting the order, while my fingers are actually typing out a coded message to the human resistance cell embedded in the Vera colony, telling them to start prepping the medical supplies for the next round of guard rotation protests. The warlord's eye lingers on me for another second, longer than it should, and I can feel the prickle of fear run down my spine, but I just keep tapping my slate, keep my heart rate steady, keep playing the overeager bureaucrat who's just happy to be given a chance to impress his boss. For 17 cycles I've played this part, lied to every single one of these monsters, watched them decide the fate of trillions of beings over goblets of blood mead and petty political squabbles, and I'm not going to blow it now. Not when the first clause of the order I'm drafting will free 2 million Vera slaves within the month. Not when the intelligence I've gathered here over the last year and a half is going to let the human diplomatic corps push through a galactic concordat resolution that bans all forms of forced labor across the entire galaxy, using the loopholes I've found in the Krall's own charter as the legal precedent. No lasers, no dogfights, just ink and lies, and the slow, grinding bureaucratic warfare the aliens never saw coming, because they thought humans were just a bunch of primitive apes who only knew how to fight with sticks and stones. Warlord slams his fist on the throne arm, yelling about the tariff rates, and the chamber erupts into chaos, representatives shouting over each other, and I slip my hand under the dais, pressing the tiny button on the underside that sends the coded message to the Vera cell, the one that tells them the executive order is coming, that the main mission clause is real, that they just have to hold on for 3 more days. 3 more days and the invasion resolution is blocked, and the first domino falls. I look up at the vaulted ceiling of the obsidian spire, at the faint glint of the alien stars visible through the thick crystal, and I think of Earth, of the smell of rain on hot asphalt, of my mom's apple pie, of the tiny apartment I used to rent in Chicago before I signed up for the deep cover program, before I agreed to let them rewrite my memories, graft the crawl chitin onto my skin, make me into something that could slip past their defenses and sit in the heart of their power, watching them. Waiting for the right moment to strike. No one here knows I'm human. No one here knows that the boring, unremarkable bureaucrat they ignore is the one who's going to bring their entire empire to its knees, not with a bomb but with a piece of paper. The warlord's gaze cuts back to me, sharp, suspicious, and I smile, the subservient, eager smile of a functionary who's just happy to be serving his warlord, and I lift my data slate like I'm already typing up the executive order. Let him look. Let him suspect. He'll never find the hidden clauses. He'll never find the coded messages. He'll never know until it's too late. The warlord's suspicion lingers like smoke curling around me, but I keep my face blank, deferential, the perfect servant. Inside, though, my mind races. Every word shouted in this chamber is another thread I can weave into the tapestry of collapse. They think they're arguing about tariffs, about who gets the larger share of tribute from the conquered systems, but I've already buried the poison pill in the language. A clause so innocuous it looks like a footnote, yet it will force them to recognize the Vera as contracted laborers with rights of termination. Rights, that single word is the crack in the dam. The Krall Chancellor leans forward, his mandibles clicking in irritation, demanding clarification on the tariff schedules. I bow slightly, pretending to search my slate, but in reality I'm cross-referencing the coded annotations I've hidden in the margins. Each annotation is a breadcrumb for the human legal team waiting back on Earth, a trail that will lead them straight to the precedent they need to dismantle the entire edifice of slavery. I can almost hear the quiet hum of the Concordat chambers, the shuffle of human diplomats preparing their arguments, armed not with weapons, but with the alien council's own words. The chamber grows louder, the arguments more heated, and I let my gaze drift to the warlord again. He's watching me too closely now. He senses something, though he doesn't know what. I force myself to breathe evenly, to keep the rhythm of a bureaucrat who has nothing to hide. My pulse hammers in my ears, but I smile faintly as if amused by the petty squabbles of my superiors. That smile is my shield. That smile is the mask that keeps me alive. I think of the Varicel waiting in the shadows of their minds, clutching the message I just sent. 3 days until the order is signed, until the chains fall away. I think of the humans who trained me, who rewrote my memories, who taught me to weaponize boredom and paperwork. I think of the rain on Earth, the smell of wet concrete, the sound of traffic at midnight. All of it feels impossibly far away, yet it's the anchor that keeps me steady in this storm. The Chancellor slams his claw down, demanding a vote. The Warlord snarls, but the Council is too fractured to unite. Perfect. Division is my ally, confusion is my weapon. I raise my slate, voice calm, suggesting a procedural delay, citing obscure bylaws buried in the Crawl Charter. They nod, irritated but compliant, because no one here wants to admit they don't understand the labyrinth of their own bureaucracy. And with that delay, I buy the time humanity needs. Time for the resolution to reach the Concordat. Time for the dominoes to fall. I lower my eyes, feigning humility, but inside I'm smiling. They'll never see it coming. Not the Warlord, not the Chancellor, not any of them. Their empire won't be destroyed by fleets or fire. It will be undone by clauses, footnotes, and signatures, and I am the hand guiding the pen. The silence after my motion is almost unbearable, a vacuum filled only by the faint hum of the chamber's ventilation. I can feel the Warlord's eyes drilling into me, suspicion sharpening into something more dangerous. He knows I've shifted the rhythm of the Council, but he doesn't yet know how. That ignorance is my fortress. I let the pause stretch, forcing the Chancellor to break it first, his claws tapping impatiently against the obsidian table. He mutters about precedent, about the need for clarity, and I nod as though I agree, as though I'm nothing more than a clerk lost in the weeds of procedure. Inside, I'm already calculating the next move. The bylaws I cited are obscure enough that even the Crawl archivists will need days to verify them. Days in which the Concordat's human lawyers will weave their arguments into the Council's own record, embedding contradictions so deep they'll look like natural fractures. The Council believes itself eternal, but eternity is brittle when bound by its own rules. I am not here to fight them, I am here to make them fight themselves. The Warlord shifts, his armor plates grinding softly, and I know he's preparing to challenge me directly. That would be disastrous. If he forces me into open defense, the mask could slip. So I lean forward, lowering my voice, offering a compromise that sounds harmless but is anything but a subcommittee review. The word alone is enough to drain the chamber of energy. No one wants another committee, no one wants more paperwork, and yet no one dares oppose it outright. They nod, weary, resigned, and the motion passes without a vote. I feel the tension in my chest ease, but only slightly. Every victory here is temporary, every delay a fragile thread. Still, threads can be woven into nets, and nets can catch giants. I glance at the Chancellor, who is already scribbling notes, his irritation masking the fact that he has just agreed to bind himself in the very net I've cast. The Warlord growls, but he cannot undo what has been recorded. The Council clerk has already etched the motion into the ledger. Ink is stronger than steel in this place. I sit back, feigning exhaustion, letting them believe I am spent. In truth, I am listening to the echoes of their frustration, cataloging every word, every gesture, every weakness. These are the weapons humanity has chosen: patience, precision, and the unbearable weight of bureaucracy. The aliens think themselves masters of conquest, but they have never faced an enemy who fights with silence, with clauses, with the slow suffocation of their own governance. They will learn, and when they do, it will already be too late. The obsidian gavel slams so hard the water in my chipped ceramic tumbler sloshes over the edge, and I keep my gaze fixed on the ledger open in front of me, scribbling a meaningless notation about quorum counts to sell the act of a tired, overworked functionary who's been on shift for 18 hours straight. The Chancellor's gravelly voice cuts through the fading hum of the chamber before the Warlord can even open his maw to protest, announcing the next agenda item. A full council vote to approve the Zythri hegemony's request to annex 3 unclaimed asteroid belts in the Outer Rim, a measure that would have sailed through with unanimous support an hour prior. The Warlord's fist slams into the obsidian table so hard a spiderweb fracture spreads across the surface near his gauntlet, his chitinous armor clattering as he leans forward, snarls dripping from his bared teeth. This annexation is time-sensitive, he rumbles, voice thick with the threat of violence. Crawl intelligence confirms human raider cells are massing in those belts, prepping strikes against Zythri mining colonies. Delaying this vote puts our client species at risk. He's lying, of course. We've had the Outer Rim surveillance feeds for 6 months. Those raider cells are Crawl black ops, planted to justify seizing the belts and building a weapons array pointed directly at the Sol system. It's the exact playbook they used to annex the Proxima Centauri colonies 3 years prior, the inciting incident for the whole war. I don't look up, just keep scribbling in the ledger, my voice flat and bored as I recite the byline I memorized 3 weeks prior. The one the Concordat's legal team planted in the Crawl archives 6 months ago, time-stamped to look like it's been on the books since the founding of the High Council. Article 7, Section 12 of the Concordat Security Protocols requires a mandatory 72-hour intelligence review period for any annexation measure tied to active external threats, to verify threat validity and prevent opportunistic land grabs during periods of heightened tension. I don't add that the article was drafted specifically to block this exact annexation, that the review period clause forced the Council to declassify the very patrol logs that prove the raiders are Crawl. That detail stays buried for now. The warlord's growl drops to a subsonic rumble that vibrates the bones of my face, and he rounds on the Chancellor, claws scraping across the table as he demands the archivists pull the text of the article immediately, calls it a fabrication, a human plant. The Chancellor's 4 eyes narrow, and he raps his gavel twice to silence the chamber, ordering 2 Crawl archivists to scurry to the vaults to verify the text. I let a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk tug at the corner of my mouth before I duck my head to hide it, pretending to fumble my stylus and drop it on the floor, scrambling to retrieve it with a flustered murmur of apology about being up all night processing the previous session's minutes. It's a small performance, but it works. The warlord's suspicious gaze flicks away from me, dismissing me as a hapless, overworked clerk too busy to pay attention to the power plays happening above his pay grade. The archivist returned 20 minutes later, pale and flustered, holding a leather-bound codex stamped with the seal of the first High Chancellor, confirming Article 7, Section 12 is exactly as I cited. The warlord snarls so loud the wall sconces flicker, but he can't argue with a 400-year-old bylaw, not without looking weak in front of the rest of the council. The Chancellor slams his gavel again, tabling the annexation vote pending the 72-hour review, and the chamber erupts in a low hum of frustrated chatter as the council members begin to file out, their ornate robes swishing across the obsidian floor. I stay seated at my low desk near the podium, pretending to organize the stacks of parchment and data chips, until the chamber is almost empty. The only other figures left a pair of Zythri aides lingering by the exit, their iridescent scales shimmering in the dim light. The shorter of the two drifts over to my desk as the rest of the council files out, slipping a tiny, unmarked data chip into the fold of my tunic before I can even react, his voice a soft, barely audible chirp that only I can hear. Legal team finished the subcommittee charter an hour ago, he murmurs. First order of business is mandatory declassification of all Outer Rim patrol logs from the last 5 years. The false flag evidence is all there, wrapped in enough procedural red tape that the warlord won't be able to bury it without looking like he's violating Concordat law. He taps the chip once, then turns and joins his companion, disappearing through the arched exit before the warlord glances back toward the front of the chamber. I wait another 10 minutes, long enough to make sure no one is lingering in the hallways, before I slip the chip into the hidden compartment in the sole of my boot, standing to stretch as though I'm just now finishing my shift. The warlord is still loitering near the exit, his armor plates grinding as he argues with a group of Crawl military advisors, and he glances my way for half a second, his yellow eyes narrowing for a fraction of a moment before he turns away, dismissing me. My chest tightens just for a heartbeat before I force myself to relax, to slouch a little, to look every bit the overworked, unimportant clerk he thinks I am. The mask held, this time. The hallway outside the council chamber is lined with towering basalt statues of past High Chancellors, their stone faces impassive as I slip past the pair of Crawl guards posted at the exit, their plasma rifles slung over their shoulders, their attention fixed on the warlord's argument rather than the lowly aide scurrying past. I don't let myself breathe easy until I'm 3 corridors away, tucked into the shadow of a service archway, pulling the data chip out of my boot to slot it into the encrypted wrist comm hidden under my sleeve. The screen flickers to life, displaying the subcommittee charter draft, the list of required evidence, the timeline for the review, all of it exactly what the human legal team promised, all of it another thread woven into the net we're casting around the High Council. My wrist comm buzzes a second later, an encrypted message from the Concordat's liaison on the Crawl homeworld, annexation tabled. Warlord is already spinning the delay as a procedural victory for his faction, claiming the review will prove the human raider threat is real. Expect him to push for emergency powers to bypass the review period tomorrow. Stay sharp. Your cover is still holding, but he's getting suspicious. I type back a one-word confirmation. then delete the message before I slip the comm back under my sleeve, turning to head toward the quarters I share with the other two human deep cover agents embedded in the council staff, a translator who's been planting mistranslations of crawl diplomatic communiques for 8 months, and an archivist who's been doctoring council records to create contradictions between different factions, policy claims for the last year. We're 3 threads, thin and fragile, but we're already so tangled in the council's own bureaucracy that they can't pull us out without tearing the whole system apart. The warlord thinks he's fighting a delaying tactic, a minor annoyance in his push to crush humanity. He doesn't know that every delay, every procedural roadblock, every contradictory bylaw we plant is another layer of the trap we're building. He thinks the council is eternal, unbreakable. He doesn't know that we've spent the last 3 years studying every crack in its foundation, every petty grudge between factions, every useless rule they've accumulated over 1,000 years of conquest. Bureaucracy isn't just a weapon for us, it's the only weapon we need. The cool basalt under my boots seeps through the reinforced soles of my issue clerk shoes as I pick up my pace, shoulders hunched, the stack of forged requisition forms clutched to my chest so tight the edges crinkle. The service corridors reek of burnt ozone and the sharp, fishy tang of crawl stim tea, the hum of the lower-level fusion conduits thrumming through the stone under my feet so low I can feel it in my teeth if I stand still too long. A pair of crawl scribes rounds the corner ahead, their chitinous faces split in argument over a shipment manifest, and I duck my head, muttering a string of broken crawl about a missing crate of power cells for the warlord's personal guard before they can glance my way. They grunt, wave me past, too busy bickering over who's going to catch the blame for the shortfall to notice the faint glint of the human-made override tool tucked under my sleeve, the one I used to hack the biometric lock on the subcommittee chamber door an hour prior. The door to our shared quarters hisses open before I even tap the override code, Kale leaning against the frame, his 4 slender arms crossed over his chest, the pale blue gills on his neck flared in irritation. "You're late," he says, his accented English soft, the translator implant behind his ear whirring quietly as he switches from the guttural crawl he's been faking for the past 8 months. Myra found another forged entry in the Border Patrol logs, the one we planted last week. The warlord's people are already using it to push for the annexation vote next cycle, instead of waiting for the review. I step inside, letting the door seal shut behind me, the faint hiss of the locking mechanism cutting off the distant clang of crawl guards' boots in the corridor. The quarters are cramped, the stone walls lined with stacks of physical council scrolls and half-empty ration bars, the air thick with the acrid smell of the solvent Myra uses to edit centuries-old council records. She's hunched over the low stone table now, her goggles pushed up onto her frizzy auburn hair, her fingers stained dark with the chemical as she rubs out a date scrawled in the margin of a brittle parchment scroll, the one we planted in the ancient council archives last month to create the 900-year-old bylaw that forced the annexation review in the first place. "Let me guess," she says without looking up. "The liaison says the warlord is going to push for emergency powers tomorrow to skip the review entirely." I nod, slipping the encrypted wrist comm out from under my sleeve, slotting the data chip I pulled from my boot into its port. The screen flickers to life, displaying the subcommittee charter draft we spent 6 months building, the clauses buried so deep in procedural jargon even the most experienced crawl bureaucrat would need 3 weeks to unpack them all. He's already spinning the delay as a win for his faction. Says the review will prove the human raider threat is real. He thinks we're just stalling. Kale snorts, leaning over my shoulder to scan the text, his clawed fingers tapping a clause near the bottom of the page. Good, let him think that. I spent the last week mistranslating his emergency powers proposal for the lower council scribes. Added a little rider that says if emergency powers are granted, all pending annexation votes get put on hold for a full standard crawl year, while the council conducts a full audit of all target worlds' resource claims. He smirks, the sharp points of his teeth glinting. The audit will dig up all the embezzlement records Myra planted in the warlord's annexation funding files last month. The other factions will turn on him, so fast his head will spin before he can even cast a vote. Myra finally looks up, pushing her goggles back down onto her forehead, her eyes sharp. "I already planted the fake witness testimony the Concordat legal team asked for. 3 anonymous Border Patrol officers who saw human raiders attacking a civilian mining outpost 6 months ago. Their statements are full of contradictions, dates don't line up, weapon descriptions don't match the fake plasma rifles the warlord's people are peddling, signatures are forged using the template of a Border Patrol officer who died 20 years ago. If anyone actually digs past the first page, the whole thing falls apart." Before I can respond, 3 hard, sharp raps echo through the door, the kind that means council security, not a random delivery drone or a confused scribe looking for the supplies closet. All 3 of us freeze. Kale shoves the translation console under his cot so fast it clatters against the metal frame. Myra sweeps the edited scrolls into the hidden compartment under the table, kicking the pile of ration bars over to cover the seam. I jam the comm down my boot, grab the stack of requisition forms, and by the time the door hisses open, I'm hunched over the papers, muttering about a missing crate of power cells for the Warlord's night guard, my face flushed like I've been running through half the lower levels looking for the sign-off. The two crawl security officers at the door grunt, their plasma rifles slung over their shoulders, their carapaces still streaked with the dust from the lower maintenance tunnels. "We're looking for a Vrax spy," the taller one says, his voice a low rumble. "Slipped into the lower levels an hour ago. Seen anyone matching the description? 6 feet tall, iridescent carapace, carries a data spike." I shake my head, flipping through the requisition forms like I'm panicking over the missing signature. "No, sir." Only people I saw were a pair of scribes arguing over a shipment manifest in Corridor 7 and a group of maintenance workers fixing a conduit in Corridor 9. No Vrax. "I've been running forms for the Warlord's guard all morning. I haven't seen anyone out of place." The shorter security officer snorts, waving me off. "Forget it. The Vrax dissidents are probably hiding in the lower waste tunnels. They wouldn't be dumb enough to sneak into the council wing." He glances past me into the quarters, his gaze lingering on Kale for half a second too long, and my throat tightens. Kale is good at his cover, but he's been getting careless lately, letting his crawl slip when he's tired, the way he holds his fork different than a native crawl would. But the officer just grunts again, turning to leave. "Keep your head down, the Warlord is in a mood." He's already had 3 aides executed for losing his favorite battle standard this morning. The door hisses shut behind them, the lock clicking into place, and Kale lets out a breath so loud his gills flutter. Myra snorts, kicking the ration bars off the hidden compartment and yanking it open to pull out a half-empty bottle of the human liquor we smuggled in last month, pouring 3 shots into dented metal cups. "Vrax spy, huh? That was my doing. Planted a fake security report an hour ago," framed one of the Vrax embassy aides. "They'll be running around looking for him for the next 3 days at least." She passes me a cup, the clear liquid burning going down, the sharp taste of synthetic grain cutting through the stale air of the quarters. I take a sip, leaning back against the cool stone wall, the weight of the comm still pressed against my boot. "Tomorrow, the Warlord will stand before the full High Council, demand emergency powers to bypass the annexation review, push the lie that humanity is an existential threat that needs to be crushed before we can spread to the rest of the galaxy." He won't know that the rider Kale planted in his proposal will force a year-long audit that will expose his embezzlement, that the fake witness testimony Myra planted will fall apart under even the lightest scrutiny, that the procedural roadblocks we spent 3 years stacking will topple his entire push before he can even get a majority vote. He thinks we're small, scattered, a ragtag group of survivors hiding in the cracks of his empire. He doesn't know that we've spent every day for 3 years learning how his system works, how to turn his own rules against him, how to make his own paranoia eat him alive from the inside out. The Warlord has armies, plasma rifles, dreadnoughts that can crack a planet's crust. We have a stack of forged forms, a handful of mistranslated communiques, and 1,000 years of his own useless, bloated bureaucracy. It's enough. It has to be. Kale's quiet laugh rumbles low in his chest, the rough, gravelly sound he spent 3 years perfecting to match the crawl laborer cover he's worn since we infiltrated the capital. He runs a calloused finger over the chipped stone pendant strung around his neck, the one every lower caste crawl wears to ward off bad luck, and I watch the edge of the faded human tattoo peeking out from the cuff of his sleeve where the leather bracer has slipped down. He'd almost forgotten to adjust it this morning, and for half a second I'd thought the officer would see it, the thin black line of the constellation from Earth's northern hemisphere that none of the crawl would recognize, but the man had been too busy ranting about the Warlord's mood to look close. "The aide they dragged out of the East Wing 10 minutes ago wasn't the Vrax plant," he says, his voice low enough that the audio sensors in the wall won't pick it up, the faint flutter of his gills behind his ears the only tell he's lying. "That was the real Vrax attaché. The one we framed is already halfway to the outer system by now, if the transport schedules I hacked yesterday hold." Myra snorts, tapping the side of her cup with a sharp nail, the tiny glint of the microfilm forgery tucked under the nail polish catching the dim light from the overhead glow panel. "Of course he is. I made sure the security report named him as the one who stole the Warlord's favorite battle standard, not the actual schmuck who hid it in the waste tunnels last night. Warlord's too busy screaming about his honor to check if the guy even had access to the council wing." She nods at the dented metal cup in my hand. You gonna drink that or just hold it like it's gonna save your life? We've got 3 hours before the pre-council briefing. Plenty of time to panic if you want, but I'd rather use it to double-check the audit rider I slipped into his emergency powers draft. I take another sip, the synthetic grain burning less this time, and press my boot harder against the comm unit tucked in the hollow under the floor tile. A soft, thrumming pulse buzzes against my soul, the coded signal only our team can recognize. The guard captain we've been feeding misinformation to for 6 months just confirmed he's pulled 12 of his 20 security details to hunt for the non-existent Vrax spy, leaving the council clerk's office unguarded for the 45-minute window we need to swap the warlord's signed proposal with our forged copy. The one with the rider that mandates a full forensic audit of every transaction the warlord has made in the last decade, the one that will prove he's been siphoning tribute from the outer colonies to fund his private fleet, the one that will make the council turn on him so fast his head will spin before he can even open his mouth to demand emergency powers. Kale's hand twitches at his side, and I know what he's thinking. 3 years ago, we were huddled in a leaking escape pod drifting in the void between stars, watching the crawl dreadnoughts glass our home colonies one by one, convinced humanity was days from extinction. We never thought we'd make it this far, never thought we'd be sitting in the heart of the empire that tried to wipe us out, armed with nothing but forged forms, mistranslated legal codes, and the warlord's own unshakable greed. He'd almost slipped an hour ago, when the security officer's gaze had lingered on him too long, his throat frills flaring just a fraction before he clenched his jaw so hard he bit clean through his lower lip. He'd wiped the trickle of blue blood from his chin with the back of his hand like it was grease from the kitchen, but I'd seen the way his hands had shaken after the door locked. "You okay?" I ask, quiet so only he can hear. He nods, picking at the edge of the bracer again. "Just tired. The warlord made me carry his battle standard to the council chamber this morning, after the last aide got executed for losing it. He kept yelling about how no human filth would ever get their hands on it, while I stood there holding the stupid thing. Felt like I was gonna laugh right in his face." He smirks, the sharp, cruel twist that's become his default expression when he's in character as a brutish crawl enforcer. "Took everything I had not to tell him I was the one who hid it in the waste tunnels in the first place." Myra snorts again, draining the last of her shot and setting the cup down on the edge of the hidden compartment. "Please, you loved it. You got to stand 3 feet from the guy who ordered the glassing of New Seattle and pretend you were his loyal little lapdog. Admit it." She stands, stretching, the faint scar on her forearm from the extraction mission on Vrax Prime glinting in the dim light, and she pulls a stack of forged council voting records out of the compartment, flipping through them to check the signatures. "I finished planting the fake witness statements last night." The 3 council members who were on the fence about his annexation bid, their constituents just sent letters demanding they vote no unless they want to be recalled for supporting a leader who's stealing from the colonies. I forged the letters myself, used the same ink the crawl use for official communiques, even added the little smudge the outer colony scribes always put in the corner. They'll never know the difference. The comm under my boot buzzes again, a faster, more urgent pulse this time. I freeze, pressing my foot harder to muffle the sound, and Kale and Myra go quiet, their hands drifting to the hidden blades strapped to their thighs under their tunics. For a second I think we've been made, that the warlord's security team has caught on, but then the signal comes through, decoded in the microchip embedded in my ankle. The Vrax embassy just filed a formal protest with the council, claiming the warlord's security team illegally detained one of their aides this morning. The fake report Myra planted worked better than we ever could have hoped. The warlord is already tied up dealing with a diplomatic incident, his security team stretched even thinner, the council distracted by the infighting before we even make our move. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, and Kale smirks, leaning back against the wall next to me. "Looks like your little Vrax plant is working overtime," he says, nodding at the comm under my boot. Myra snorts, tucking the forged voting records back into the compartment and slamming it shut. "Told you I'm a genius. By the time the warlord figures out what's happening, half the council will have already voted to strip him of his emergency powers, and the audit will be underway before he can even order his fleet to fire on the outer colonies. He thinks he's got the galaxy by the throat, but he's too busy fighting his own shadows to see the knife we're holding to his back." I glance at the chrono on the wall, the red numbers counting down the hours until the council session starts. 3 hours? 3 hours until we walk into that chamber, sit at our little desks in the back of the room, and watch the warlord's entire empire crumble around him, all without firing a single shot, without spilling a drop of human blood. He thinks we're weak, that we're just survivors hiding in the cracks, too scared to fight back. He doesn't know that we've spent 3 years learning every rule, every loophole, every petty grudge and hidden fear in his entire government, that we've spent 3 years turning his own systems against him, that the only thing scarier than his armies is the stack of paperwork we've got waiting to bury him. The door hisses open a crack, a tiny sliver of light from the hallway spilling into the dim quarters, and a tiny, folded piece of synth paper slides through the gap, landing on the floor at our feet. I pick it up, unfolding it quickly, the tiny handwritten scrawl of the clerk we've been bribing for months clear as day. The forged audit rider is already in the stack of proposals for the session. The warlord will sign it without looking, just like he signs every other piece of paper his aides shove in front of him, too busy yelling about crushing humanity to bother reading the fine print. I fold the note up and tuck it into my pocket, meeting Kale and Myra's eyes. They both nod, the same sharp, determined glint in their eyes that got us through the last 3 years, through the glassings, through the infiltrations, through the nights we thought we'd be caught and executed before we could finish our work. We're ready. The council chamber smelled of ozone and old stone, a place where centuries of decrees had been carved into the air itself. I kept my head down, the insignia on my borrowed robes catching the dim light just enough to pass as authentic. Kale walked 2 steps behind me, his posture loose, casual, the way only someone who had memorized every guard rotation and every procedural quirk could afford to be. Myra was already inside, her forged credentials granting her a seat among the junior advisors, close enough to whisper into the ears of those who mattered but far enough to avoid the warlord's direct gaze. The stack of proposals was carried in by drones, each sheet glowing faintly with the council's seal. I watched the warlord's aides shuffle them onto his desk, his massive claws scratching impatiently at the surface as he barked at a subordinate about traitors hiding in the bureaucracy. He didn't even glance at the writer, just signed, his mark burning into the page like a brand. My pulse hammered in my ears, but I forced myself to keep breathing evenly. One careless exhale could betray more than 1,000 forged documents. The first vote began. A procedural matter dull and unremarkable, but I saw the ripple it caused, one counselor leaning toward another, whispering about the audit rider buried in the stack. Myra's hand twitched, subtle, signaling me that the seed was sprouting. The whispers spread like cracks in glass. The warlord's eyes narrowed, his nostrils flaring, but he was too late. The motion to review his emergency powers was already on the floor, already being debated, already pulling his empire apart thread by thread. I leaned forward, speaking in the calm, measured tone of a bureaucrat who had seen this all before. Procedural compliance requires the audit to be completed before any further military expenditures can be authorized. My words were dry, lifeless, deliberately forgettable, but they carried weight because the council's own laws gave them weight. The warlord slammed a fist against the desk, the sound echoing like thunder, yet the clerk beside him only nodded, confirming the rule. His fury meant nothing against the ink of his own signature. Kale's smirk was hidden behind his collar, but I caught it anyway. Myra's eyes gleamed, reflecting the chaos unraveling across the chamber. For the first time in years, I felt the tide shift, not with weapons, not with fleets, but with the quiet inevitability of bureaucracy. The warlord had built his empire on fear, but fear couldn't stop a vote, couldn't erase a rider, couldn't silence the law he had sworn to uphold. And as the counselors raised their hands one by one, stripping him of the powers he thought eternal, I realized we had done it. We had turned his own system into the blade that cut him down. But victory was never simple. His gaze swept the chamber, landing on me for a fraction of a second too long. My blood ran cold. He didn't know yet, not fully, but suspicion had already taken root. And suspicion, in the hands of the galaxy's most terrifying warlord, was more dangerous than any fleet. The cold from his gaze still clung to my skin long after he looked away, seeping through the thin layers of my court-tissued robe like frost. I kept my eyes fixed on the vote tally scrolling across my datapad, tapping the stylus against the screen at a steady, unremarkable rhythm. 2 quick taps, a pause, 1 long tap. Myra's signal back was nearly imperceptible, a slight tilt of her head as she adjusted the glassware on her tray, the glint of the crystal catching the light just so. Phase 2 was green. The clerk's droning voice confirmed the result a second later, the motion to suspend the warlord's emergency war powers passing 17-3, the dissenting votes coming from the 3 counselors he'd bought with stolen military stockpiles last quarter. The chamber hummed with a low, disbelieving murmur, the kind that comes when a tyrant's fist cracks open for the first time in decades. The warlord's claws curled so tight around the edge of his desk the metal groaned, but he didn't roar. He couldn't. Not with the full weight of Galactic Council law stacked against him, not with every recording drone in the chamber pointed directly at his face. "Recess," he barked, the word sharp enough to cut glass, his yellow eyes sweeping the room again, lingering a fraction longer on Kale this time, then on Myra, then back to me. 30 standard minutes. All motions related to the audit will be tabled until I have reviewed the full text of the rider for procedural inconsistencies. He didn't say until I find the traitor who slipped it in, but the subtext hung in the air thick enough to choke on. I stood with the rest of the junior bureaucrats, folding my datapad shut and tucking it under my arm, making sure the forged ID badge clipped to my robe glinted just enough for the security drones scanning the room to pick it up. I'd planted the fake alibi footage 3 days prior, me, standing in the lower-level commissary at 800 that morning, arguing with a supply officer about missing nutrient-paced rations for the council staff. If the security team pulled the feeds, they'd see me there, harmless, boring, exactly the kind of mid-level functionary no one ever paid attention to. Kale fell into step beside me as we filed out of the chamber, his shoulder brushing mine just long enough for his voice to drop below the hum of the crowd. He's already pulled the surveillance from the document staging area. They're cross-referencing every biometric scan from the past 72 hours against the list of known dissidents. You're clean, but only because I swapped your scan out with a janitor's last night. Don't stray from the group. I nodded, not breaking my stride, keeping my face blank the way we trained for 3 years back on Earth, the way every deep-cover operative since the first human spy slipped into a Roman legion had learned to do. Boredom was the best camouflage. I let my eyes glaze over slightly, mumbled something about needing to file the vote paperwork before the recess ended, and peeled off toward the admin wing, away from the main crowd of council staff hurrying to the mess halls. My wrist comm buzzed under my sleeve the second I was out of sight, Myra's coded message flashing across the tiny screen. Audit writer confirmed to include slave raid investigation. Warlord's off-world holdings will be frozen in 12 hours if we push the motion after recess. Security is compiling a list of suspects. Be careful. I ducked into an empty storage closet, closing the door behind me and leaning against the cool metal wall for half a second, letting myself breathe. This was the part the training videos never prepared you for, the split second between victory and exposure, where one wrong move could turn the blade you de-sharpened against your own throat. The warlord's suspicion was a live wire, crackling and ready to spark, and we were all standing in its path. But we didn't come this far to back down. I tapped the comm twice, sending the pre-agreed signal for proceed as planned, then adjusted my robe and stepped back out into the hallway, heading for the admin office where the clerk I'd spent 6 months bribing with rare earth tea was waiting to file the next motion. The warlord thought he could stall, thought he could hunt us down in the 30 minutes of recess, but he'd forgotten one critical thing: bureaucracy didn't take breaks, not even for tyrants. The admin wing hummed with the low thrum of 1,000 terminals, the air smelling of recycled oxygen and burnt synth coffee as I cut through the maze of cubicles, nodding at the 24 other low-level staff who didn't spare me a second glance. The bribed clerk Vrel was exactly where I'd left him 3 days prior, hunched over his terminal in the corner office, his 3-fingered hands flying over the keys so fast they blurred. I closed the door behind me, locked it, and tapped the coded sequence against the edge of his desk. 2 taps on the left wrist, 2 on the wood, the signal we'd agreed on for proceed with filing. Vrel's slitted yellow eyes flicked up, then darted to the security camera in the corner of the room. He tapped it twice with one claw, then pulled up the docket template on his screen. I buried the audit writer under code 7B, routine financial compliance for extra-system resource extraction permits, he said, his voice a low rasp, no Thraxian accent, just the flat bored drawl of a functionary who'd spent 40 years filing paperwork no one ever read. It's stacked under 412 other routine motions, no flag, no alerts. If we push the vote before the end of recess, the freeze on the warlord's off-world holdings triggers automatically. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, my shoulders loosening just a fraction when his terminal pinged so loud it made me jump. Vrel's face went ashen as he pulled up the alert, his fingers hovering over the keys like he wanted to delete it before I could see. Security took Rook into custody 10 minutes ago, he said, his voice tight. They found a backdoor he left in the archives server to pull the slave raid evidence. He's already talking. They're cross-referencing the access logs from the archives with every staff member who was in the building that day. Your old janitor scan, the one Kale swapped for you, it's flagged. They're matching it to the access log from the document staging area 72 hours ago. They're going to know you were the one who planted the evidence. Before I could respond, a heavy knock rapped against the office door. Vrel's eyes went wide, and he yanked the stack of routine sanitation budget reports off his desk, shoving them into my hands before I could protest. Act like you're just here to review the line items, he hissed, slumping back in his chair and putting on a bored, annoyed expression. I'll handle it. I flipped open the top report, letting my shoulders slump, letting my face go slack like I was just another overworked, underpaid admin stuck dealing with a pointless last-minute review, when Vrel called out, "Just a minute, I'm in the middle of a Q3 sanitation budget audit, can't this wait?" The door slid open with a hiss and two Thraxian security officers stepped in, their black chitinous armor scuffed from the border skirmishes the warlord had been throwing the council's resources at for the past month, plasma batons humming at their belts. The taller one, his mandibles clacking, held up a hollow of Rook, the janitor we'd had on the inside for 18 months, his face bruised and swollen from what looked like hours of interrogation. "We're looking for anyone who was in contact with this traitor in the past 72 hours, he said, his voice a low growl. "You seen anyone matching the description of the human who planted the slave raid evidence in the archives?" Vrel squinted at the hollow, then shook his head, waving a claw at the stack of reports on his desk. "Nah, that's the sanitation tech from Deck 7. I saw him arguing with the supply officer about missing nutrient paste rations in the commissary this morning. He's probably still down there, bitching about his missing lunch. You want him, you'll find him there." The shorter officer stepped closer, his antennae twitching as he sniffed the air, and my heart skipped a beat. I doused myself in the neutral pheromone suppressant Kale had slipped me before the recess started, but Thraxians could smell fear, could smell a lie, and I could feel the sweat beating at my hairline under my scalp prosthetic. He leaned in, his yellow eyes locking on mine for a second too long before he huffed and stepped back. "You smell like that overpriced earth tea they sell in the commissary. The janitor drinks the synthetic swill. Move along, but don't leave the chamber. We'll be questioning everyone who accessed the archives in the past week after the vote." I nodded, mumbling something about needing to file the budget reports before the recess ended, and shuffled out of the office, my hands trembling just a little as I held the stack of papers to my chest. The hallway was emptying as council staff filtered back into the chamber, and I saw Kale leaning against a wall near the entrance, pretending to type on his comm. He tapped his wrist twice as I passed. Code red. I nodded back, keeping my head down as I walked. The chamber was already buzzing when I slipped in through the side door, taking my usual seat in the back of the admin gallery, out of sight of the warlord's podium. The presiding officer, the ancient Thraxian Vorth, was rapping his gavel to call the chamber back to order, and the warlord was already standing, his scaled chest puffed out, yelling about how the council needed to focus on the border skirmishes instead of wasting time on baseless accusations against him. I flipped open the budget report in my lap, my mind racing. Rook had talked. They knew about the motion, they knew about the spy ring, and they were going to sweep the admin wing in 20 minutes. I was done for, and less than Lyra, the warlord's personal aide, the asset we'd spent 14 months grooming, stood up from her seat next to the warlord, raising a three-fingered hand to signal a point of order. Vorth nodded at her and she spoke, her voice clear and steady, no hint of the nerves I knew she was feeling. "Point of order, presiding officer. Under Article 7, Section 3 of the Galactic Council Charter, any item on the docket with a confirmed audit rider attached must be brought to a vote before any non-emergency business is considered, per the financial compliance mandate ratified 3 cycles ago. Docket Item 7B, the audit of extra-system Warlord holdings, was confirmed valid 2 standard hours ago. The motion to bring it to a vote is in order." The chamber erupted. Half the council members were on their feet yelling. The warlord's face turned so red I thought he might burst a blood vessel, his mandibles clicking so fast they were a blur as he screamed that the rider was fraudulent, that it was a human plot to undermine his authority. Vorth banged his gavel 3 times, his voice booming over the noise. "The aide is correct. The item is in order. All in favor of bringing docket item 7B to a vote, say aye." I stood up in the gallery, shouting aye as loud as I could, joining the hundreds of other admin staff and minor council members who were yelling aye, their voices drowning out the warlord's protests. The ayes had it by a margin of 3-1. Vorth banged his gavel again, declaring the vote certified, and the freeze on the warlord's off-world holdings went into effect immediately. His slave fleet detained at the orbital dock before they could jump to the hidden colonies where he'd been trafficking sentient beings for the past 20 years. I sat back down, letting a small, almost unnoticeable smile tug at the corner of my mouth when my wrist comm buzzed under my sleeve. Myra's coded message flashed across the tiny screen. "Freeze confirmed. Slave fleet detained. 12,000 beings freed. Good work." But Rook gave them a description of the human spy. "Security is sweeping admin wing in 15 minutes. Get to the DOCKING bay. Transport leaves in 12. I stood up, shuffling out of the gallery with the rest of the staff, keeping my head down, when Kale fell into step beside me, slipping a crumpled sanitation tech uniform into my hands, along with a new ID badge. "Rook gave them a description of the guy who recruited him, not the guy who planted the evidence," he said, his voice low, no hint of the panic I was feeling. "Lyra's covering for you, said she saw you in the commissary the whole time. The transport's waiting at Bay 7. It's got a clearance for a maintenance crew heading to the Earth relay station. Get on it, don't look back. I ducked into a side hallway, swapping my admin robe for the gray sanitation uniform, tucking the old ID badge into my pocket, picking up a mop from the supply closet at the end of the hall. I blended in with the rest of the sanitation crew heading for the service elevators, mopping a spot on the floor that was already clean when the elevator dinged at the docking bay level. The guard at the transport door held up a hand, scanning my new ID, his comm pinging. He looked up at me, his antennae twitching, and for a second I thought he was going to call security. Then he smirked, handing me a data pad. Lyra sent this. Says you're her cousin, here to fix the life support on the transport. Cleared you for passage. Hurry up, the ship's undocking in 3 minutes. I took the data pad, stepping onto the transport and finding a seat in the back next to a crate of nutrient paste. As the ship lifted off, the engines humming under my feet, I pulled up the data pad, Lyra's message flashing across the screen. Rook gave them a false name. They're looking for a THRAXIAN male, 6 foot scaled, you're clear, see you on Earth. Don't forget the Darjeeling I ordered for next time. I leaned back in the seat, closing my eyes as the ship broke orbit, the blue curve of Earth growing larger in the viewport. We D1, for now. The warlord would come after us, would send spies to Earth, would try to retaliate, but we'd been playing this game for 18 months. We knew how to hide, how to use the system against them, how to turn their own bureaucracy into a weapon. Boredom was the best camouflage after all, and next time we'd be ready. The hum of the transport was steady, almost hypnotic, but I couldn't let myself drift. Every detail mattered now. The sanitation badge in my pocket wasn't just a disguise, it was leverage. The council's bureaucracy was a labyrinth, and if you knew how to walk its corridors, you could vanish into them. That was the trick, not to fight, not to run, but to become invisible inside their own rules. I scrolled through Lyra's datapad, finding the maintenance logs she'd planted. They were flawless, down to the serial numbers of the oxygen filters. If anyone checked, they'd see a backlog of overdue inspections, all signed off by a fictitious supervisor whose credentials matched the council's registry. It was the kind of detail that made the difference between survival and exposure. We didn't need weapons, we had paperwork. Kale's words echoed in my head. Boredom was the best camouflage, he was right. The council's guards weren't looking for spies, they were looking for anomalies. A sanitation worker with a mop was forgettable. A technician with a datapad was routine. But a nervous glance, a misplaced word, a hesitation, that was what got you killed. I forced my breathing to slow, my posture to slump, my eyes to glaze over like I'd been doing this job for years. The transport jolted as it entered Earth's atmosphere, the viewport glowing with streaks of fire. My heart raced, but I kept my face blank, staring at the nutrient paste crate as though it were the most fascinating thing in the galaxy. The guard across the aisle yawned, antennae drooping. Perfect. If he was bored, I was safe. When the ship touched down at the relay station, I followed the crew out, blending into the shuffle of boots and chatter. The docking bay smelled of ozone and disinfectant, the air heavy with the hum of machinery. I slipped into the maintenance corridor, swiping the badge at the checkpoint. The scanner blinked green. No alarms, no questions, just another worker on another shift. And yet, beneath the calm surface, I knew the game was tightening. Rook's betrayal had bought us time, but the council wasn't stupid. They'd dig deeper, cross-reference records, chase shadows until one of them led back to us. That was the inevitability of espionage. Exposure was only delayed, never avoided. But delay was enough. Delay meant another fleet freed, another council edict twisted against itself, another chance to turn their own system into a weapon. I walked down the corridor, the datapad warm in my hand, and allowed myself the smallest smile. We weren't soldiers, we weren't conquerors. We were clerks, janitors, auditors, lawyers. And in a galaxy ruled by terror that was more dangerous than any army. The corridor narrowed, its walls lined with conduits that pulsed faintly like veins carrying the lifeblood of the council's machinery. I kept my pace steady, the datapad angled just enough to suggest I was cross-checking systems. In reality, I was watching the timestamps tick forward, each one a breadcrumb in the trail we'd laid. Bureaucracy was a beast that devoured itself, and we were feeding it carefully measured lies. At the junction, a pair of inspectors blocked the path, their mandibles clicking in quiet conversation. I slowed, adjusted my posture, and let the weight of routine settle over me. One of them glanced at my badge, eyes flicking across the holographic seal. He didn't see me, he saw the paperwork. That was the beauty of it. The council trusted its own systems more than it trusted its people. And we had become the system. I handed over the datapad, feigning irritation at the interruption. The inspector skimmed the logs, antennae twitching in mild annoyance. Overdue inspections, missing requisitions, a backlog that stretched into months. It was all there, perfectly mundane, perfectly damning. He sighed, stamped the clearance, and waved me through. I almost laughed. They thought they were catching mistakes. In truth, they were authorizing sabotage. Further down, Kale was waiting, disguised as a logistics officer. His uniform was crisp, his expression bored to the point of hostility. He slipped me a sealed packet without a word. Inside were the Council's latest edicts, restrictions on planetary trade, new quotas for resource extraction. We'd already prepared the countermeasures. By the time these orders reached the colonies, they'd be buried under appeals, audits, and procedural delays. Entire fleets would stall in bureaucratic limbo, their terror campaigns reduced to paperwork disputes. I tucked the packet away and kept walking, the hum of machinery masking the thrum of my pulse. Every step deeper into their labyrinth was a gamble, but it was also a victory. We weren't fighting them with guns or ships. We were fighting them with signatures, seals, and the suffocating weight of their own governance. And the longer we stayed invisible, the more their empire unraveled from within. Exposure was inevitable, yes. But until that moment came, we would keep feeding the beast one forged document at a time. Kale didn't speak, but the flicker in his eyes told me everything. Council's edicts were tightening faster than we'd anticipated. They were desperate, clawing at the colonies with rules so suffocating they threatened to collapse their own supply chains. That was the weakness we thrived on. Desperation breeds oversight, and oversight breeds loopholes. We were the architects of those loopholes. I moved deeper into the archives, where the walls curved into a chamber filled with towering stacks of encoded directives. Each one was a law, a decree, a mandate meant to keep the galaxy in line. To the Council, this was order. To us, it was chaos waiting to be redirected. I slid the packet into the system, watching as the edicts merged seamlessly with the backlog. Within hours, clerks across a dozen sectors would be drowning in contradictions, trade routes authorized and denied simultaneously, quotas impossible to fulfill, penalties issued before compliance deadlines even existed. The Council would spend weeks untangling knots we'd tied in minutes. A shadow passed behind me. I didn't turn. To react was to reveal. Instead, I tapped the datapad, pulling up a requisition form so banal it could bore a predator to sleep. The shadow lingered, then moved on. My disguise held. That was the trick. Invisibility wasn't about vanishing. It was about becoming so unremarkable that no one remembered you were there. Later, in the dim recess of a maintenance alcove, Kale and I reviewed the next phase. A single forged audit report routed through the proper channels would trigger a cascade of investigations. Entire fleets would be grounded, not by resistance fighters, but by compliance officers demanding signatures. The Council's terror would stall under the weight of its own rules, and no one would suspect the humans buried in its bureaucracy. I felt the tension coil tighter in my chest. Exposure was always a heartbeat away. One misfiled document, one suspicious glance, and the facade would crumble. But that was the gamble we lived by. We weren't soldiers. We were saboteurs armed with pens, seals, and the patience to let an empire destroy itself. And as I slipped the audit report into the system, I knew the Council had already begun to choke on its own governance.